You know, there is a moment that happens on the side of a highway, in a gas station parking lot, or maybe even in your own driveway that can change the entire trajectory of your day, your freedom, or your future. It is a moment that most people never see coming. And it usually starts with a knock on the window and a very simple, very common request from a law enforcement officer. I have spent years studying the intersection of travel, law, and human behavior. And if there is one piece of advice I want to drill into your brain before you even think about turning that ignition key for your next road trip, it is this. When those lights flash in your rearview mirror, your mind is going to race. Your heart is going to pound. And in that split second of panic, you are going to want to be the most cooperative person on the planet. But before you open that door or shift your weight to step out, I need you to ask yourself one specific question. Have you ever actually considered what your rights are the moment an officer asks you to step out of the vehicle? And more importantly, have you ever thought about what happens if you say no? I really want you to stop and think about that for a second. And when you have a moment, drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me about a time you were pulled over, or even just witnessed a traffic stop, and what went through your head when you saw the officer approaching. I am genuinely curious to know if you felt safe, if you felt scared, or if you just did exactly what you were told without question. I am asking because the answer to that simple question, the one about stepping out of the car, is not as straightforward as the movies and television shows make it out to be. And if you get it wrong, you might inadvertently give up rights you didn't even know you had. Or worse, you might find yourself in a situation that spirals out of control before you can even blink. So, let's sit down, let's talk about this, because I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to look at those flashing lights in your mirror a little differently, and you are going to be a much more informed traveler. Let's set the scene, because context is everything here. You are driving down the interstate. Maybe you are heading to the airport to catch a flight. Maybe you are on the last leg of a long road trip home. Or maybe you are just running errands. The music is playing. You are thinking about your day, and then you see them. The red and blue lights appear out of nowhere. The first thing you feel is a jolt of adrenaline. It is a universal human response. Your hands tighten on the wheel, your mouth goes dry, and your brain starts running through a checklist of everything you might have done wrong. Were you speeding? Did you roll through that stop sign? Is your registration expired? That immediate fear is completely normal, but it is also the exact emotion that law enforcement officers are trained to recognize and, in some cases, utilize. They know you are scared. They know you are off balance. And they know that a person who is off balance is far more likely to agree to things they might otherwise refuse. Now you pull over safely. You turn off the car. You put your hands on the steering wheel where they can be seen, which is always a smart, respectful move. The officer approaches, and after the standard exchange about license and registration, they might say something that sounds like a simple procedural request. They might say, "I need you to step out of the vehicle." And for 99% of people, the immediate reaction is to comply. You think, if I do what they say, this will be over faster. If I argue, I look guilty. That is human nature. We are conditioned from childhood to respect authority, to listen to police officers, and to assume that every request is backed by law. But here's the thing that a lot of travelers, especially those who haven't dug into the nuances of constitutional law, don't understand. That request, "Step out of the car," exists in a very specific legal gray area, and your response to it can completely change the nature of the interaction. Let me break down what is actually happening in that moment, not from a perspective of defiance, but from a perspective of understanding. When an officer asks you to step out, they are, in most cases, invoking a principle established by the Supreme Court in a case called Pennsylvania versus Mims. Back in 1977, the court ruled that once a police officer has lawfully stopped a vehicle, they can order the driver out of the car, even if they have no reason to suspect any danger. The court's reasoning was based on officer safety. They argued that a traffic stop is inherently dangerous, and allowing the officer to separate the driver from the vehicle reduces the risk of the driver accessing a weapon or causing harm. On the surface, that makes sense, right? We want our officers to be safe, we want them to go home at night. But what the ruling created is a situation where a legal stop for a minor infraction, like a broken taillight, can quickly escalate into a much more invasive encounter simply because you are now standing outside the bubble of your car. And this is where I want you to pay close attention, because this is the part that most people miss. Once you are out of the car, you are no longer in your private space. The interior of your vehicle, while not as protected as your home, still carries a reasonable expectation of privacy. But the sidewalk, the shoulder of the road, that is public space. And more importantly, once you are standing outside, the officer's ability to observe you, to interact with you, and to ask you further questions expands significantly. They might see something in your pockets. They might notice the smell of alcohol on your breath more easily. They might ask you to perform field sobriety tests, and if you agree to those tests, you are providing evidence that can be used against you. The entire dynamic shifts from a simple citation to a potential investigation, all because you stepped out of the metal box that was actually providing you with a certain layer of legal protection. Now, I'm not suggesting that you should ever be belligerent or refuse a direct order in a way that could be perceived as combative. That is a fast track to a very bad outcome. What I am suggesting is that you need to understand the nuance of the interaction. There is a massive difference between physically refusing to exit the vehicle and simply asking a clarifying question. If an officer asks you to step out and you have a genuine concern, maybe it's raining, maybe you are physically disabled, maybe you are not wearing shoes, you have every right to ask, "Officer, may I ask why you need me to step out of the vehicle?" Now, will the officer answer you? Maybe, maybe not. Some will give you a reason. Some will simply repeat the order. But the act of asking the question does a few things. First, it breaks the script. It shows that you are not just a passive participant who will follow every instruction without thought. Second, it forces the officer to articulate a reason, which can be important if the situation later goes to court. And third, it buys you a moment to think. The problem is that most people, in that high-stress moment, forget they are even allowed to think. They forget they are allowed to speak. They operate on pure reflex. And that reflex is compliance. And while compliance is generally safe, blind compliance can sometimes lead you down a path you didn't intend to walk. Let's talk about what happens after you step out of the car, because this is where the consent trap really starts to snap shut. Once you are standing there on the shoulder, the officer might start asking you questions that have nothing to do with the reason you were stopped. Where are you coming from? Where are you heading? Is there anything illegal in the car? Do you mind if I take a quick look? These questions are designed to elicit either incriminating statements or consent to search. And this is where the traveler's mindset often fails them. If you are on a road trip, you might think, "I have nothing to hide, so why not let them look? It will be faster." I cannot tell you how many times I have seen travelers make this mistake. They are innocent. They have a clean car. They are just heading to a national park or to visit family. They let the officer search, thinking it will speed things up. But what they don't realize is that by giving consent, they are waiving their Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches. The officer is not required to have probable cause anymore. They can now open your glove box, they can look in your trunk, they can rummage through your luggage. And if they happen to see something that is even slightly out of place, something that looks like drug paraphernalia or an open container, or even a knife that exceeds the local legal limit, that observation, which they were only able to make because you gave them permission to be in your space, becomes the justification for a deeper search, an arrest, or a citation. I want you to really think about the psychology of that interaction from the officer's perspective. They are trained to gain compliance. They are trained to use conversational techniques that make it hard for you to say no. They might say, "You don't mind if I take a look around, do you?" That phrasing, "you don't mind," is a linguistic trick. It presupposes that you are agreeable. Saying no to that question feels awkward, feels rude, feels like you are being uncooperative. But you have the absolute right to say, "I do mind, I do not consent to any searches." And here is the critical part. Saying that is not an admission of guilt, it is an assertion of your rights. You can say it respectfully, you can say it calmly. You can say, "Officer, I respectfully decline to consent to a search." And then you stop talking. The silence that follows that statement is often the most uncomfortable part. The officer might stare at you. They might ask again. They might try to pressure you by saying things like, "If you have nothing to hide, why won't you let me look?" This is a classic interrogation technique. It is designed to make you feel like your refusal is illogical. But you don't have to justify your rights. You don't have to explain why you are asserting them. The Constitution doesn't require you to have a reason. You have the right to be secure in your papers and effects. Period. And as a traveler, understanding that you carry that right with you, even on the interstate, is perhaps the most powerful tool you have. Now let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture of travel safety and legal encounters. I have spent a lot of time studying how these rules apply differently depending on where you are. If you are traveling through a state with laws that are very different from your home state, you might not be aware of local quirks. For example, some states have stop and identify statutes, which require you to provide identification if you are suspected of a crime. But a traffic stop for a minor violation is often not considered the kind of detention that triggers those laws. It's a tangled web, and the confusion is exactly why having a clear, calm understanding of your baseline rights is so important. One of the biggest misconceptions I encounter from fellow travelers is the idea that you have to answer every question the officer asks. You don't. You are required to provide your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. That is the extent of your mandatory cooperation in most jurisdictions. You are not required to answer questions about where you are going, where you have been, or what you are doing. In fact, the Supreme Court has repeatedly held that silence in the face of police questioning cannot be used against you as evidence of guilt. Yet, time and time again, I see people chattering away, nervously filling the silence, offering up information that the officer never even asked for. They say things like, "I'm just coming from my friend's house. We were watching the game. I only had 2 beers hours ago." The officer didn't ask about alcohol. But now, they have an admission that you consumed alcohol, and that gives them a reason to start investigating for DUI. This is what I mean when I say that knowledge is your best defense. The encounter on the side of the road is a high-stakes conversation, and like any conversation, the person who talks less usually has the advantage. Your goal should be to be polite, to be calm, and to say as little as possible while still complying with the basic requirements of the law. Hand over your documents. If asked to step out, you have a decision to make based on the circumstances. If you are elderly, if it's freezing cold, if you have a medical condition, you might want to politely explain that and ask if you can remain in the vehicle. The officer may still insist, and legally, they can. But at least you have tried to mitigate the situation. Let's go deeper into the MIMS rule, because it's fascinating, and it has evolved over time. While the officer can order you out for safety, that order is tied to the original purpose of the stop. If the stop is completed, if the officer has written the ticket and given it to you, the legal justification for the detention ends. At that point, you are free to go. But officers will sometimes try to extend the encounter by asking for consent to search after the citation is issued. They might say, "You're all set with the ticket, but before you go, can I ask you a few more questions? Or, can I take a look inside?" At that moment, you are technically free to leave. If the officer hasn't returned your documents, you aren't really free, but if they have, you can say, "Am I free to go?" If they say yes, you can simply drive away. You do not have to stick around for a voluntary chat. This is a tactic used frequently at traffic stops and even at airports. It's called a consensual encounter. The officer is trying to transition from a legal detention back to a consensual conversation, where you are free to leave, but they are hoping you won't realize it. They are hoping you'll feel obligated to stay and answer their questions. This is where your awareness as a traveler is critical. If you have your documents back and the citation is in your hand, you are done. You can say, "I'd rather not answer any more questions and I'll be on my way." And then you go, you roll up your window, and you leave. It feels rude, I know. It goes against every social instinct we have, but it is your right and it protects your privacy. Now I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the emotional and psychological side of these encounters, because the law is one thing, but the human element is what actually plays out on the pavement. I have had my own share of interactions with law enforcement over years of traveling across this country. Most of them were professional, quick, and uneventful. But I have also seen the dynamic shift in an instant based on something as simple as a tone of voice or a misunderstood gesture. When an officer asks you to step out of the car, they are often at their highest state of alert. They don't know who you are. They don't know what is in your car. They are running on adrenaline too. So, how you handle that moment is crucial. If you decide to ask a question or assert a right, the way you do it matters. I always advise people to use a calm, even tone. Keep your hands visible. Make no sudden movements. If you want to ask why you need to step out, do it while keeping your hands on the wheel. Say, "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate. I'm just a little confused. Is there a specific reason you need me to get out?" This phrasing is non-confrontational. It shows you are willing to cooperate, but you are also seeking information. It might work, it might not, but it frames you as a reasonable person. What you want to avoid is the aggressive "why" "I haven't done anything wrong" approach. That immediately raises the officer's hackles and makes them perceive you as a threat, which can escalate the situation toward handcuffs faster than you can imagine. There is also a practical side to this that has nothing to do with legal rights and everything to do with personal safety. If you are pulled over at night in an unfamiliar or isolated area, you might have legitimate safety concerns about getting out of your car. I have heard stories of people being pulled over by unmarked cars or by individuals impersonating officers. In those situations, your hesitation is not just a legal strategy, it is a survival instinct. Many states allow you to drive slowly to a well-lit, populated area before stopping if you feel unsafe. You can put on your hazard lights, slow down, and even call 911 to confirm that the officer behind you is legitimate. If you are asked to step out in a dark, deserted area, it is perfectly reasonable to express your concern. You can say, "Officer, I'm not comfortable stepping out here due to safety. Is it possible to move to a gas station up the road?" Again, you are not refusing. You are negotiating for a safer environment. The intersection of travel and law is full of these gray areas, and the more you travel, the more you realize that the rules are not as black and white as they seem. Take, for example, the issue of rental cars. If you are driving a rental car, the legal landscape shifts slightly. The car is not yours. The expectation of privacy might be diminished because the rental company has a vested interest in the vehicle. However, you are still the lawful driver, and you still have rights. The officer doesn't have free rein to search the car just because it's a rental. They still need probable cause or your consent. But I have seen travelers hand over rental agreements and then stand by passively while officers rummage through their luggage, simply because they didn't realize that their rights in a rental are essentially the same as in a personal vehicle. The key is to remember that you are in control of your person and your belongings, regardless of who owns the metal box around you. Let's talk about the aftermath of a stop, too. Suppose you did step out. Suppose the encounter escalated. Suppose the officer searched your car and found something, or didn't find anything, but you still feel like your rights were violated. What do? This is where being a savvy traveler means documenting the encounter. If it is safe to do so, you have the right to record the interaction. In most states, you can openly record police officers performing their duties in public, as long as you don't interfere. Your cell phone is a powerful tool. It creates an objective record of what was said and done. I always tell people, if you feel the situation is tense, turn on your camera and place it on the dashboard or hold it where it can be seen. The knowledge that they are being recorded often changes the behavior of everyone involved, including the officer. It encourages professionalism. But you have to be smart about it. If an officer tells you to put the phone down, you have to weigh the risks. In some jurisdictions, disobeying that order can lead to obstruction charges. However, many courts have upheld the right to record. It's a delicate balance. My advice is usually to record passively if you can, without making a big show of it. If the officer asks you to stop, you might say, "Officer, I'm just recording for everyone's safety." And then you have to decide whether to comply or to continue, knowing the potential consequences. It's a personal decision that depends on the specific situation. As we go deeper into this, I want to come back to the original hook because it ties everything together. The request to step out of the car is a threshold moment. It is the point where a routine stop can become something else. It is the point where your privacy is most at risk. And it is the point where most people, through no fault of their own, make decisions they don't fully understand. I have been studying this for a long time, and I still find new nuances in the case law and in the stories that people share with me. Every state has its own court rulings, its own interpretations of federal law, and its own police procedures. What is accepted practice in California might be completely different in Texas or New York. That is why I am always asking people to share their experiences. When you comment below, you are not just telling a story. You are helping build a knowledge base for other travelers. Maybe you had an encounter where asking a simple question de-escalated the situation. Maybe you had an encounter where you felt pressured and you didn't know what to do. Sharing that helps all of us understand the patterns, the good and the bad. It helps us see that behind every traffic stop is a human interaction, with all the complexity that entails. I want to tell you about a specific scenario that a friend of mine went through, because it illustrates how quickly things can go sideways. He was driving through a Midwestern state, heading to a family reunion. He had his kids in the back seat. The car was packed with suitcases and gifts. He got pulled over for a minor speeding infraction. He was polite, handed over his documents, and then the officer asked him to step out. My friend, thinking he was being helpful, immediately got out. The officer then started asking him questions about where he was going and if he had any weapons or drugs. My friend said no, he didn't. Then the officer asked if he could look in the car. My friend hesitated, but then he thought about his kids in the back seat, and he thought about how long it would take if he argued. He said yes. The officer spent 20 minutes going through the car. He unpacked suitcases. He looked under seats. He found nothing, of course, because there was nothing to find. But the kids were scared, the family was delayed, and my friend felt violated. He later told me, "I didn't know I could say no. I thought if he asked, he must have a reason." That is the core misconception right there. The officer doesn't need a reason to ask. They can ask anyone, anytime, but you have the power to say no. My friend didn't know that. He gave up his privacy because he didn't understand the rules of the game. And that is exactly why I am writing this, because I don't want that to happen to you. Now, let's consider the flip side. What if you say no? What if you politely decline to step out or decline a search? What happens then? In a perfect world, the officer accepts your refusal, finishes writing the ticket, and sends you on your way. In the real world, it might lead to a longer detention while the officer calls for a K-9 unit to do a free air sniff around your car. The Supreme Court has ruled that a dog sniff around the exterior of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop is not a search, so they can do that without probable cause. This is a tactic used frequently. The officer might detain you long enough for a dog to arrive. If the dog alerts, that gives them probable cause to search. Regardless of your consent, it's a workaround. But it's a legal one, so even if you assert your rights, you might still end up with a search if the dog hits on something. This is where the concept of delay becomes important. The detention can only last as long as is reasonably necessary to complete the mission of the traffic stop. If the officer finishes writing the ticket and then waits 20 minutes for a dog, that delay might be unconstitutional if there is no reasonable suspicion of other criminal activity. It's a complex area, and it's constantly being litigated. But for you, the traveler, the lesson is that asserting your rights is not a magic shield. It might still lead to a search, but that search will then be based on probable cause, not on your consent, and that distinction matters if you end up in court. I also want to touch on something that is rarely discussed, and that is the role of fatigue and travel stress in these encounters. When you have been driving for hours, you are tired, your judgment is impaired, your patience is thin, you are more likely to make mistakes, to say things you don't mean, or to agree to things just to end the interaction. If you are on a long road trip and you see those lights, take a deep breath. Recognize that your mental state is compromised. That recognition alone can help you slow down and think more clearly. Don't let the exhaustion push you into a bad decision. If you need a moment to collect your thoughts before answering a question, take it. It is okay to sit in silence for a few seconds. It is okay to say, "I need a moment to think about that." You are in control of your own mouth. As we move toward the latter part of this discussion, I want to circle back to the idea of travel as a holistic experience. Travel is about freedom, about exploration, about seeing new things, but it is also about responsibility. Responsibility to yourself, to your passengers, and to the law. Understanding your rights is not about being anti-police. It is about being pro-citizen. It is about ensuring that the balance of power in that roadside encounter remains as balanced as possible. Police officers have a difficult job. They face real dangers. But they also have immense power. That power is checked by our rights. When you know your rights, you are not being difficult. You are being a participant in the constitutional process. I have met people who say, "I just do whatever they say to avoid trouble." And I understand that. I really do. The path of least resistance is often the easiest, but the path of least resistance can also be the path that leads to a permanent record, a fine for something you didn't do, or a violation of your privacy that leaves you feeling powerless for weeks. The small inconvenience of asserting your rights in a polite way is nothing compared to the long-term hassle of dealing with the consequences of a search gone wrong. Think about the airport analogy for a second. When you go through TSA, you are in a different legal environment. The rules are different. You have to show your ID, you have to go through the scanner, you have to submit to search if the alarm goes off. That is the price of boarding a plane. But on the highway, you are not in that special needs environment. You are in a public space, and the rules are different. Yet, many people treat a traffic stop like an airport security checkpoint, assuming that they have no choice but to submit to every request. They don't realize that the Fourth Amendment is still in full effect, right there on the asphalt. I want you to imagine a scenario where you are pulled over and you handle it perfectly. You pull over safely, you turn off the car, you put your hands on the wheel. The officer approaches, you hand over your documents, they ask you to step out. You politely ask if it's necessary. They say it is. You step out. Then they ask if they can search. You politely decline. They ask again, applying pressure. You decline again. They finish the citation, give it to you, and you ask, "Am I free to go?" They say yes. You get back in your car and drive away. In that scenario, you have done everything right. You complied with lawful orders. You asserted your rights when asked to consent to a search. You remained calm and respectful. You left with your privacy intact. That is the goal. That is the sweet spot.
Now, let's talk about the outliers. The situations where the officer doesn't take no for an answer. The situations where they order you out and then order you to stay out while they search, claiming they have probable cause. This is where things get legally sticky. If the officer claims probable cause, they don't need your consent. They can search. But you can still verbally state that you do not consent, and you can observe and record what they do. If they find something, your lawyer can later argue that the probable cause was insufficient, that the search was illegal. But that is a battle for the courtroom, not the roadside. On the roadside, your job is to survive the encounter with your safety intact and your mouth shut beyond stating your non-consent and asking if you are free to go. I have to stress the importance of the phrase, "Am I free to go?" This is the magic question. It clarifies the nature of the encounter. If the officer says yes, you leave. If they say no, then you are being detained, and they need to have a reason. At that point, you can ask, "What is the reason for my continued detention?" They may or may not answer, but asking the question creates a record. It shows that you were not voluntarily staying, you were asserting your desire to leave. This is critical for any later legal challenge. As we go even deeper, let's look at the psychology of the officer. They are human. They have biases, good days, bad days. They might have just dealt with a violent suspect an hour ago. They might be in a bad mood. Your interaction with them is a tiny slice of their day, but it could be a huge part of yours. Approaching them with a demeanor that is calm and respectful, even while asserting your rights, is more likely to lead to a positive outcome. I am not saying you should grovel. I am saying you should be a professional in your own interaction. Treat it like a business transaction. You are providing documentation. They are providing enforcement. You have boundaries. That is all. There is also the factor of race and bias in traffic stops. It would be disingenuous of me to write a long piece about roadside encounters without acknowledging that these interactions are not the same for everyone. Statistical data shows that people of color are stopped more frequently, searched more frequently, and subjected to more force during traffic stops. This is a reality of travel in America. For some people, the risk of asserting a right is higher because the officer's reaction might be more volatile. This is an unfortunate truth, and it adds another layer of complexity to the decision-making process. If you are in a situation where you feel that asserting a right could escalate to violence, your personal safety has to come first. You might choose to comply and fight the battle later in court or through a complaint. It is a terrible position to be in, but it is a reality that many travelers face. Knowing your rights is still important, but knowing when to prioritize physical safety over legal principle is a judgment call that only you can make in the moment. I want to shift focus to something that doesn't get enough attention: the post-stop analysis. After you drive away, your brain will be flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. You will replay the moment over and over. You might think of things you wish you had said or hadn't said. This is normal. If you feel that your rights were violated, write down everything you remember as soon as you can. Note the time, the location, the officer's name and badge number if you got it, and the details of the interaction. This record is invaluable if you decide to file a complaint or if you receive a citation that you want to fight in court. Memories fade fast, especially after a stressful event. Get it on paper or in a note on your phone while it's fresh. Now, let's talk about passengers, because they are often forgotten in these discussions. If you are a passenger in a car that gets pulled over, you have rights too. You are not required to identify yourself in most states, unless the officer has reason to suspect you have committed a crime. You are allowed to remain silent. You are allowed to record. And importantly, you are generally free to leave if the officer says you can. But if the officer asks you to step out, the same MIMS rule applies. They can order passengers out for safety reasons as well. The Supreme Court extended the rule to passengers in a case called Maryland versus Wilson. So, if you are in the back seat and the officer asks you to get out, legally, they can do that. Your choice, like the driver's, is to comply or to question, but compliance is usually the safer physical play. However, as a passenger, you are in a unique position. You are not the one being cited for the traffic violation. You have less to lose in terms of the immediate legal consequences. You might be able to calmly ask questions that the driver feels uncomfortable asking. You might be able to de-escalate by being a calm, respectful presence. Or you might just sit quietly and observe. The key is to not interfere with the driver's interaction. Don't shout things from the back seat. Don't argue with the officer on behalf of the driver unless you are asked. Be a silent witness, ready to record or remember if things go sideways. I want to circle back to the title of this piece because it's a warning, and warnings are meant to be heeded. Lawyer warning. If police say step out of the car, know this first. What is the this that you need to know? It's everything we've talked about. You need to know that you have rights, but you also need to know how to exercise them without creating a scene. You need to know that stepping out changes the dynamic. You need to know that consent is a choice, not an obligation. You need to know that the encounter has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that you are allowed to leave when it's over. You need to know that your demeanor matters. You need to know that you are not alone, that millions of people are stopped every year, and that most of them walk away with nothing more than a ticket. But you also need to know that a small percentage of stops turn into something more, and being prepared for that possibility is the mark of a smart traveler. Think about the preparation you do for a trip. You pack your bags, you check the weather, you map your route, you make sure your car has oil and air in the tires. You do all of that to ensure a smooth journey. Why wouldn't you also prepare your mind for the possibility of a legal encounter? It is just another part of travel preparation. It is just another tool in your kit. And like any tool, you need to know how to use it before you need it. You don't want to be reading the instructions while the house is on fire. You want to have the knowledge ingrained so that when those lights flash, your calm, prepared self takes over, not your panicked, compliant self. I have spent a lot of time in airports and on highways, watching how people interact with authority. I have seen the deer in the headlights look. I have seen the aggressive confrontations. I have seen the quiet, respectful exchanges that end with a warning instead of a ticket. The common thread in the positive outcomes is usually awareness. The person knew what was happening. They knew the script. They didn't let the situation control them. They participated in it. That is the goal, to be a participant, not a victim. As we get deeper into the weeds, I want to touch on something that might seem trivial but is actually very important. Your physical position during the stop. If you are still in the car, your hands should be on the wheel. If you step out, your hands should be visible. Don't put them in your pockets. Don't reach back into the car without telling the officer what you are doing. These small actions signal that you are not a threat. They reduce the officer's anxiety, which in turn reduces the likelihood of an overreaction. It's basic psychology. You want to appear as non-threatening as possible while still maintaining your dignity and your rights. Now let's talk about the language of rights. I often hear people say, "I know my rights." But when you ask them what those rights are, they give a vague answer. Knowing your rights means knowing the specific phrases. I do not consent to a search. Am I free to go? I am going to remain silent. I would like to speak to a lawyer. These are not magic words that stop everything, but they are clear signals to the officer that you are aware of the legal landscape. They put the officer on notice that you are not going to be a passive participant. They create a record, and they are the first step in protecting yourself. I also want to discuss the aftermath of a stop if you are arrested. This is the worst case scenario, but it happens. If you are arrested, the rules change completely. you are now in custody. Your car might be impounded and inventoried. Your personal belongings might be seized. At this point, your only job is to remain silent and ask for a lawyer. Do not try to talk your way out of it. Do not answer questions. Do not explain. The time for explaining is over. The time for talking to a lawyer has begun. The vast majority of people who talk their way into deeper trouble do so after they are arrested, thinking they can clear things up. You cannot clear things up. You can only make things worse. Shut up. Lawyer up. This advice sounds harsh, but it comes from years of watching how the system works. The system is not designed to help you. It is designed to process you. Your lawyer is the only one on your side in that process. So, give them the best possible chance by not providing the prosecution with evidence in the form of your own words. Let's bring this back to travel, because that's our focus. You are on a trip. You have places to be, people to see, experiences to have. The last thing you want is for a traffic stop to derail your plans. But if it happens, and it might, you now have a framework. You know that the request to step out is a pivot point. You know that consent is a choice. You know that silence is golden. You know that the encounter has an end. You are prepared. And being prepared takes the edge off the fear. It gives you a sense of control in a situation where control is easily lost. I want you to think about the stories you hear in the news, the ones where a routine stop turns into a shooting, or a beating, or a wrongful arrest. Those are extreme cases, but they happen. And in many of those cases, the situation escalated because one party or the other didn't know how to handle the